Hello, everyone, and welcome to your second week, where today we're going to be talking about archetypes. So initially, I had planned to do a lecture and some activities around our shadow, which is a really big component of the map of our psyche. So I find it really useful to create a map of the land first, a lay of the land of our psyche, before we talk about dreams or active imagination. And so I got a ton of emails this week asking about what the different archetypes in dreams meant. And based on all of that feedback, I decided to switch lanes and kind of jump ahead a little bit and do a lecture on archetypes. And then we'll circle back to aspects of the unconscious mind, which include the unconscious or the collective unconscious, which we'll dive into even more, as well as archetypes. So just remember that archetypes go within the bucket or within the framework of the collective unconscious, and also within the framework of shadow. But just so you have some archetypes to get going with, this should be useful as you kind of dive a bit deeper into analyzing dreams. So this is an image I have, and when I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, I have absolutely seen this before in a dream. And so when we're talking about a dream, it's really important to note that it's not as important if you remember your dreams or you don't. We can have things like daydreams. We can also have other hypnotic states where we are tapping into the unconscious, not just when we dream, but it might be a daydream, or you draw some images of first thing that comes to your mind when you wake up in the morning. And so we see that there's many imaginal abilities of the mind that are often reflected in states of dreaming, active imagination, and even hypnosis. And so Jungian or analytic psychology is really about healing the psyche. So if you're not somebody that remembers your dreams, remind yourself that that's not a requirement and that maybe isn't your access point to the unconscious. So right now within mental health, psilocybin therapy is growing and legal in several states, as well as ketamine treatment. In many indigenous cultures, we have things like frog medicine or ayahuasca. So know that you can pull from these big collective experiences as we do our dream analysis. And really, dream is just a metaphor for everything that's unconscious. And there are various states of trance that you can access to get to certain frequency of brain waves. Specifically, when we're talking about the subconscious state, it's a theta brain wave. And that retaining link to the unconscious is often the alpha state of the mind. So just thinking kind of we're going through different theta waves and alpha waves as we traverse into the unconscious mind. It's also important to know that the conscious mind tends to defend the ego and persona. And so all of these ego personas can kind of be dropped when we get to the unconscious mind. So just a little disclaimer, when I say dream work, it doesn't necessarily have to be a dream from sleep. So with that being said, let's jump in and talk about this image a little bit. So you can see that there's circles, there's rectangles, there's a lot of geometry that's present in it, as well as color. And in this dream that I had, I was a pot, and there were several other pots of clay. And in the dream, I saw another woman break her clay pot. It was as her body just broke into pieces. And as she broke, she looked at me and said, "You have to empty yourself to go home." And I was kind of horrified because she just broke. And immediately when she broke, I noticed she turned into a little circle and started to return back to source, or back to what I perceived to be home. But what became very different about this dream wasn't just the symbology of going home and that word being spoken, but it was also the aspect that there was a feeling quality that was undeniable and very visceral and real in this dream, where it felt like my body was a magnet and all it wanted to do was to unify with these other circles and shapes into oneness. And so I think that that metaphor of this dream can be taken in so many different ways as we analyze throughout today, and as I give you a script for how to analyze dreams and unconscious experiences and active imagination just in general. So for me, this dream was really potent. And so months later, I went and spoke with the woman who was represented as this clay pot. And I said, I had this dream about you, that you were literally just like in the fire and you just allowed your shell of your person to break so you could go closer home to this beautiful, lovely magnetic pool. And she says, Anna, that is wild. At the time you had the dream, my office burnt down, and it absolutely was this metaphor of letting go and shedding a layer and breaking the pot of expectations, which is pulling me somewhere deeper. So again, we get to, in this class, dive into Jungian themes like synchronicity, which happens all around us. And we also get to jump into themes today around these personality motifs that live and exist in the unconscious. So let's jump in. So here are some key learning outcomes for today's lecture. First is going to be a mind map. So just understanding how we map out the psyche, and this is not necessarily how we map out the brain. They're different. I'm happy to bring in some more brain anatomical structures as we go, especially when we explore emotions, feeling, and affect related to dream states. So we'll look at a bit more of the human anatomy and physiology. But for today, we're really still in the land of symbol, and we'll be taking a look at Jungian archetypes as well as the critique of Jung, which based on our lecture last week, knowing that the Rolling Stones were reading this individual and the Beatles had him featured on the Lonely Hearts Club Band, it kind of makes it hard to make a critique of such a figure, but it's out there in mainstream psychiatry and psychology, so we'll look at it, as well as a dream analysis checklist. Yay, I know you're all ready for this. And so again, I just want to remind you, it can be dream analysis, but any other state, the theta brain state that allows us to get access to the subconscious mind is going to be what we're working with. And of course, you can still apply the mind map to any of those experiences. We're also going to jump into sacred geometry, and I'll describe why the word sacred is in front of that, but just geometry as well as color exploration. So let's jump in. So Jungian mind map. So this photo here is great because it really articulates the access point that Carl Jung used to get to these unconscious states. He drew mandalas every day of his life. And if you recall, in last week's lecture, we spoke about the different or various Bardo states. And so in Tibetan Buddhism, drawing these tankas are also called, is an act of prayer of connecting to altered states of consciousness, not just of yourself, but of other deity and people. And so he was very much connected to this geometric shape and motif, and was something that he used to create that access point in his waking state. So if you're someone that isn't an active dreamer, I'm more of a prophetic dreamer. I don't tend to dream every single night, but when I dream, it's very deep and vivid and clear. And so I'm not someone that's going to be writing my dreams down every day. So if in the course you're still interested in accessing the theta brainwaves, then a really nice way to go about it is to take some time in your morning or before you go to bed and just draw some mandalas or some sacred geometry or shapes that can stimulate that access point. So as far as his mind map, it includes the self, the persona, the shadow, and then the anima and animus. And so we'll unpack that a bit more, as well as talk about the differences between Jung's concept of the psyche and Freud's. So in Freud's map, it's stated that the human mind centers upon the id, the ego, and the superego. And we have to note that Carl Jung and Freud really had some separation in how they saw this, because Jung's critique of Freud was it can't just be the id, which is the drive. Often Freud used it as a sexual drive, can't be linked and can't be the only reason why folks have psychosis. And so he believed that there was more of a spiritual aspect in these structures of our human drive. So Jung divided the human psyche into ego, persona, shadow, animus, as well as all of these four constructs operating in the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And he really pulls out the unconscious by highlighting the term archetype. And so he defines archetype as a piece of instinct and the unconscious. So it's important to note that for him, archetypes represent the possibility of certain types of perception or action. And this perception, action, and kind of imprint is existing in the collective unconscious. So you can kind of see that it's in this wider outer area of the inner world. And so for both Freud and Jung, they believed that how we saw a window into the person's psyche was the defense mechanism, which we'll talk about when we do shadow work, of projection. So the investment of others with conscious or unconscious quality in ourselves. So it might be that because we feel really happy and excited and love summer, that we assume unconsciously that everybody else loves summer. Or a really nice example of a collective projection. Are you ready? Achoo! Yes, bless you. Everyone's like, yes, bless you, Anna. And trust me, I'll take all the blessings. I'm down for that. But it's the idea that there's this automatic response that because someone's heart stopped, that they need a blessing, which is a very old motif that can be found in the American English-speaking collective unconscious, and I'm sure other cultures, of just the simple unconscious act of responding with a bless you. And so again, there's an implicit bias deep down in our brain that if someone is sneezing, their heart might stop. And so in that aspect, perhaps we need to give them a blessing. So projection shows an access point into the collective unconscious. The activity we did last week with free association and the 12 astrology houses was a great example, again, of projection. So a little insight into the collective and personal unconscious. So Jungian's mind map was a bit different than Freud. It wasn't just ego, which is sexual drive, or id rather, and then ego is more that kind of negative, materialistic, hungry, selfish aspect of self that dominates. And then that was contrasted with the superego, which was more of the higher consciousness or religious mindset. It was only 3 aspects. So Jung disagrees and comes on the scene and says there's several more aspects that comprise the self. So the persona is the ideal aspect of self. It can be our false mask or adaptation to society. I think a good example of persona for many folks, and not just females, but is the idea of beauty construct, where when you leave the house, it's like, oh, put on some mascara or some makeup. That absolutely is that part of that persona of being prepared or seen in a certain light. So another aspect of the psyche is the shadow work, which I'm so excited to jump into, but is the inner split off complex that contains all of our rejected values. And I think rejected values is really important, right? As humans, most of us don't want to feel jealous or angry or be portrayed as selfish or self-centered. So we tend to reject those values within us, and often they get projected onto other people, places, or situations. And then we have the anima and animus. And so according to Jung, he was kind of using a bit of biological theory to come up with this definition of the soul, which is kind of an interesting juxtaposition. So it's the idea that we all have a biological sex, correct? That gets reflected in a spiritual light. So in the unconscious, the feminine side in males and the masculine tendencies in females. So I think that it's important to just note that this can be seen as problematic, right? Because we know that gender is not based on biological sex. They're different things. Gender is a cultural construct that's created and reinforced from a young age. And so I don't know that we need to juxtapose a gender role onto spirit, which in my perspective, that's really based more on like Buddhist texts, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead or European way of Buddhism, that there's this idea that really we're just holding neutral and that we all embody feminine and masculine characteristics. But where I disagree with Jung is that it's rooted in biological sex, because we know in various cultures that biological sex isn't a marker of gender. So just wanted to name that and take a moment to queer a little bit of the anima and animus construct of Carl Jung. The other piece is the ego. Ego is not seen as something negative to be destroyed, to leave outside of the yoga room. It's a piece of the psyche that contains conscious awareness of our sense of identity. So ego is often defined as being in the center of consciousness, the field. So it has access in some areas to the unconscious, but it's our drive in life. And this drive is different than Freud's use as being something negative. And this, in my perspective, is just more of a personality construct, the ego. And then the self is the accumulation of all previously listed aspects. Whew, okay, so that means that our self, like our identity in this type of analytic psychology, is persona, so how we want to be perceived. Shadow, the parts that like, let's reject that. I do not want to be perceived as selfish, mean, racist, whatever it is, right? We reject those values. And then we also have this part of spirit that is gendered for Jung, and I assert that it can be both. We can have a spectrum and a neutrality on the soul level, and then the ego is kind of the center point of all of that. That is our conscious awareness. So in short, those are the aspects of the self, and the mind map, according to Carl Jung, that it's important to note is different than Freudian psychology. Okay, so let's jump into archetypes. Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. So in the Handbook of Jungian Psychology, which is written by an individual named Rinos, there is a compilation of various articles based on Jungian work. And Anthony Stevens does this great job talking about archetypes. And some of the things that he illuminates in Jung's work is that Jung, when he was originally coming up with the idea of archetypes, drew parallels between biology, religion, and crystallographic structures of an axial system of a crystal. And so there's a great quote that he brings in when we're looking at archetypes, because we often think of it as this inherited thing. So let's break that down first before we get into crystalline structures. So the term archetype for Jung was meant to denote an inherited idea rather than an inherited mode of functioning. So I'm going to read a quote by him. It corresponds to the inborn way in which the chick emerges from the egg, the bird builds its nest, a certain wasp stings the motor ganglion of the caterpillar. The eel knows how to make its way to the Bermudas. In other words, it's a pattern of behavior. This aspect of the archetype is purely biological and is the proper concern of scientific psychology. In addition to pulling this, and that comes from 1949, his idea on there being this biological overlap. He also states that every man is born with profound differentiated functions, various mental functions, which are either ontologically developed or acquired, and ontology is just our framework of the world. And there are remarkable analogies by the unconscious and the most separated of groups of people and races. So you can see he is blending in this aspect of culture being part of an archetype, as well as just innate human biology. And then he goes on to bring in this primordial image or motif of self-portraits. And in this link of archetypes and instincts, he explains that there are parallels to geometry that can also be seen in archetypes. Very cool. And I think that this piece is really important to note as we take a deeper look on archetypes according to Carl Jung. So as part of this idea that biology is part of the next generation and that there are cultural, social, and linguistic impacts that form certain motifs or archetypes in the collective unconscious, he states that it is, my view, a great mistake to suppose that the psyche of a newborn child is a tabula rasa, in the sense that there's absolutely nothing in it. So it really is a philosophical argument that we're jumping into now, which is, are humans born with a blank slate, or are they born with innate capabilities? And so Jung is saying we are absolutely not born as a blank slate. Rather, there are aspects of the psyche that are inherited. So he's taking a philosophical stance on human psychology. And so he goes on to say, they are, in a sense, the deposits of all of our ancestral experience, and that's the collective unconscious. Ooh, very cool. And so for him, it wasn't the direct experience of the ancestor, but there's a sense that ancestral memory is also stored in this aspect of the psyche. So his theories emerged from a hospital he was working at, where he studied delusions and hallucinations of schizophrenic patients, and was fascinated that motifs and images occurred in myth across many cultures. So he thought it was very strange that even though these European patients in the 1920s and 30s had never been to parts of Central or South America or Australia, but were picking up on myths and motifs that existed in all cultures. He also asserted that these archetypes or images have universal meanings across culture, and where they show up as dream, literature, art, or religion. And I would definitely add on to that and say that it might even be active imagination or other aspects of the psyche. And so there absolutely is implicit memory that we can tune into. And this is a component of somatic memory. And soma just means body. So it's the idea that the brain and faculty have access to recollections of behavioral, emotional, and perceptual forms of memory. So according to Jung, our primitive past becomes the basis of our human psyche, and there can be a large number of archetypes. He predominantly wrote about 12, and in addition to the 12, he paid attention to the 4, which we named on our mind map, which included persona, shadow, you got it, animus, and ego. Nicely done. And then the self is kind of the container for all of that. So I spoke a little bit about the instinctual examples from the previous quote about biology, but what's interesting is modern biology has some discord with Freud. They're like, we don't necessarily see that, but where there's more of this archetypal theory in modern research is really kind of put forth by psycholinguistic author Noam Chomsky. And so 1965, he articulates that there is an innate language acquisition device. So tabula rasa, he was like, that's not real. So Noam Chomsky in 65 was able to say, yep, language acquisition is part of the central nervous system and can also incorporate deep structures in which all languages are processed. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit more, because where we're going next is some of the critiques, and the critiques on Freud are pretty biological. So I'm curious to see how this lands and sits with you. Okay, so let's go here. Critiques of Ernest Jones, who was Freud's biographer. So he stated that Freud is concluding that Jung descended into a pseudo-philosophy out of which he never emerged. And so in this context of science, calling something pseudo is quite insultive, because it's saying that you don't have any objectable merit in what you're working or writing on, and attributes many of part of Jones's critique is that he contributes Jung's ideas to more of a new age mythical speculation rather than a scientific contribution to psychology. However, while Jung's research into ancient myth and legend, his interest in astrology and fascination with Eastern religion, like these are all an insult to Jung, according to Ernest Jones, can be seen in that light. So just in the light of astrology and fascination. It is also worth remembering that the images he was writing about as a matter of historical fact and exerted an enduring hold on the human mind. So there's this critique that Jung is part of pseudo-philosophy, and that absolutely is not the case. This is someone that is a journal editor for the first journal of Analytic Society in Europe. It's someone that is working in hospital settings and is still being described as a pseudo psychologist or philosopher. So that's really interesting how much tension we can see there was between Freud and Jung, and even Ernest Jones, Freud's biographer. But the big drawbacks are really this piece of biology, which does not have a lot of weight, because in the 1940s, there were two ethnologists, Nico Tinberg and Konrad Lorenz, that proposed behaviors in which animal species are equipped have innate releasing mechanisms that are sign stimuli that are encountered by the environment. And these occur through adapted evolution. And so we can see that there's definitely this comparison of ethological findings that Jung spoke about that are emerging in some of the innate releasing mechanisms that Lorenz and Tinberg were writing about in their research in the 1940s. And so I think it's important to note that within mainstream psychiatry and psychology, Freud is not, Jung is not accepted in all communities. Recently, I was having dinner with a friend who was telling me that in Europe, when she was receiving psychoanalysis, if it was titled as laying down, aka psychoanalytic, that there was no insurance billed for it. But if it was psychotherapy and the same activities and hypnotic states were accessed sitting up, then insurance would cover it. And so I just want to take a moment and laugh at that and say that as licensed counselors and psychotherapists and psychologists, there still is a bit of tension around pseudopsychology and trying to map out the unconscious mind. So this isn't widely accepted in all circles. And I do think it is important to note that with the critiques, there is some biology we can reference back to in the 1940s in the work of Lawrence and Tinberg, and then more recently, a nice overlap with Noam Chomsky's work on language acquisition devices, that yes, there are innate structures in the brain that allow us to learn certain things. So all agreeing and pointing to Jung's idea that we are not a blank slate when we come into this life. Okay, so Jungian archetypes, now that we looked at some of the critiques from the more biological community, and let's jump in. So I've also heard the question of how many archetypes did he identify? And this is important because I think that Jung has inspired a lot of people. And so out of that, there's an outcropping of 64 different archetypes or even more and variations on this. But how I'm going to present it is archetypes that Jung identified and developed. If you have other systems of different archetypes, Caroline Myss also has some really neat archetypal work in her book. Let's see, Sacred Contracts is really nice other text to explore archetypes, but these ones come from the source. So he identified several archetypes, which our personalities aspire to be more like. And I also included a nice little link so that if you want to do a personality test to see which one you are more aligned with, that's something that you can play with. So I'll give you a moment just to look over visually what it is that you're seeing for the 12 archetypes and see if any of these symbols sit with you or jump out at you or you get some resonance. So I'll give you just another minute. I know some folks like to write them down, so I just want to make sure you don't feel rushed at all and you can take your time with this. All right, so hopefully you got them down, and you can see that there's 4 inner structures, which is the spiritual journey, or folks who are spiritual, those that are more inclined to legacy or mark, connection or structure. And so even if you don't remember all of the other outcroppings, think of 4. So in your notes, I would write down 4 aspects: spiritual, legacy, connection, structure. And so we all, in his theory, fall into one of these 4 areas of life. And so let's break that down a little bit more. So within the spiritual box, we can see those who create safety and innocence. Knowledge is the sage, freedom, the explorer. Another word for sage is the wise one. So that motif or image can appear as a wise old man or woman, or non-binary person. And these may be represented as an authority figure, such as a teacher, spiritual leader, guru, or mentor. And these are often related to visions, dreams, insights of guidance. So even any faith that you may have, like the Buddha or Jesus, or just religious figures. So that's an example from sage. Let's take another one or another example from Leaving a Mark, the magician. So the magician is about power. It's another archetype that is associated with alchemy, someone who can bring creation to life. And the magician is often a shapeshifter in dreams, appearing to remind you the tools needed to return to dreams and reality, or to turn dreams into reality. So last class we talked about um, the Bardo states, and one of the purposes of dream work is to create alignment in our waking state. And that alignment in those twofold places allows us to live a more fulfilled, aligned, balanced life, so that our dream time and our wake time are unified. And so that's an example of the legacy piece, or the magician of leaving a mark. And so you can kind of sense what an outlaw might be, right? Of leaving that through, or the heroic aspect of things. So another one of connection that I think is important to note is going to be the great mother, or the lover is another aspect of that. And so in that archetype, there is a nurturing, often maternal figure or lover, someone with mama energy, if you will, and shows up to remind you in your dreams that great mother is about nurturing yourself deeply. And it's also a way to provide reassurance. So it's the idea that it doesn't necessarily mean our biological mother, but it's also the idea that Earth, like planet Earth, embodies feminine and masculine principles of energy, but really becomes the source of deep support for us. So even if we don't have deep support in our family life, or our sexual or relationship aspect of this human context, that we can always pull into connection with others and to Earth. And I think the lover is a really nice aspect of intimacy as well as support. So in this box, we also have the lover, the gesture, and every man, which is about the belonging archetype. And then the structure can be seen as things like caregiver, ruler, or artist. And so the artist is very much what we're going to focus on, but is this idea of creativity, raw, powerful, passionate energy, and innovation. And so that doesn't have to be innovation for the collective, but really it's innovation for you, of how can you take something in life and make it magical. So an artist motif or archetype may come up in a dream of someone painting, or it may be more artistic with food. And so we want to be able to put those metaphors together as we're analyzing. So in week 2, I'll absolutely include some more information on these archetypes, looking at each one, and that way you can take a deeper dive to see how they're showing up. Okay, so again, kind of humorous to think that Jung was being critiqued by some members in the scientific community, when he really left behind so many beautiful attributes to the scientific community, especially within psychology and personality studies. So this is adapted from the Myers-Briggs personality test. And where does this come from? Yep, can I get a drum roll? Yep, it sure does come from Carl Jung's. And as you can see on his map, or his motif, there's 12, and here it's a bit different, but we still have these primary personality types that pop out. And so another nice tool you can use is the Myers-Briggs personality test, as a form of self-study, and really just checking in with your energy. Because if we're an introvert and we are doing an extroverted job, that's really exhausting. In the same way, if we're an extrovert and we have to enter data quietly in a solo solitary office all day, that's also a leak of our energy because it's not aligned. So there will be a whole lecture on deeper aspects of Myers-Briggs, but I just wanted to put that into this slide of this is how archetypes have made its way into mainstream psychology and psychoanalytic theory as just the personality test. Okay, so we covered a bit of how Carl Jung defined archetypes as being ancestral deposits, as there being a connection between linguistic frameworks as well as learned biological tendencies, and how he identified 12 archetypes in addition to the 4 that comprise the mind map. And so now what I've done is here's a list for you of the various archetypes according to Freud. So with them, and since hopefully you had a moment to write them down, and if you didn't, no problem, you can always come back to this later and do this activity. But I'm going to invite you to grab a pair of scissors. I know you're like, what is this? Kindergarten, maybe 3rd grade? Yep, you get scissors. And once you have these archetypes cut out, what we're going to do is just put them in a pile of paper off to the side. And you can get as creative as you want with this activity and spend like 3 hours. I definitely suggest that you consider the setting you're doing it in. Maybe you're on a walk right now or just cooking and listening. And so right now isn't the time, but definitely think about aspects of where you're doing it and what time of day and just the general healing vibe before we move into this next activity. Okay, so the next activity is going to be creating a list of the 12 houses and then mapping each of the 12 houses with an archetype. I know, it's so exciting. So just to recap from last week, we know that there's 12 houses and each house in astrology has 100 different words or meanings according to Vedic astrology. And so I'm just giving you a few. So for example, first house is identity. Second house is food or money. Third house is travel or siblings. Fourth house is home. Yep, what is fifth house? Entertainment, play, creativity, children. And so what I've done is in the course reader, you'll have access to the list of your 12 houses and also the 12 archetypes. And then what you're going to do is a little bit of divination, which again is another tool that Jung articulated that can help us get to the beta states or the unconscious mind to see where we have focus points within our various houses or buckets of life. So an example is going to be, let's say I draw right now. I'm drawing for my first house. So I'm going to pick up one of these little symbols I created, or maybe just words on a piece of paper that I cut out. And then I'm going to put them in a bowl. And once you have them in your bowl, go ahead and just swirl them around. And once you have them swirled, go ahead and just pull one out that you identified for the first house. So I'm going to do this activity with you and let you know what comes up for me. And we're just going to do one as an example. All right, so I pulled Explorer, and that Explorer goes into my first house. And I would definitely say that I have a curious identity or a curious nature to me. So what you can do is go through and use the worksheet in lesson 2 to create a little map of where you have focal points using Jung's archetypes. This is also a great technique you can use to analyze a dream or a vision or an active dream of just putting your little archetypes in a bowl and pulling one out as you're exploring a dream to see if you don't get any first impressions. Using chance and synchronicity is a really nice way to do some of that unconscious exploration. All right, so let's jump in. Here is what you've been waiting for, application to dreaming. So we know this is a winter dream psychology class, and it is super snowy where I'm at right now. It's like a good 4 or 5 inches on the ground. It's beautiful. I feel like I'm in a little snow globe here. And again, it's reminding ourselves that our waking world and our dream life can have alignment. And so what I hope for you is in this application that you have a little checklist that you can go through to unpack and sit with some of the symbols that the unconscious mind is working to make conscious. So our primary textbook for the course is Dreams, A Portal to the Source by Edward Whitman and Sylvia Pereira. And so in this book, it's really a light read. It's not too heavy. I also suggest if you haven't gotten the book, you can definitely get it used. I think I got my book used for like $8, so it wasn't too expensive. If you buy it brand new, I think it's a little bit more. So last week we went through chapters 1 and 2, which is just kind of an introduction to various imaginative techniques. So it talked a little bit about meditation, gesalt therapy, psychodramatic enactments, dream figures, drawings, as all ways that we access, quote unquote, this dream state. And so in chapter 3, it's titled The Situation as It Is. The author's first quote from Carl Jung is, "The dream is a spontaneous self-portrayal in symbolic form of the actual situation of unconscious." Interesting. So the dream is a spontaneous self-portrait that is using the language of symbology to tell us what's actually going on in our unconscious mind. So in this chapter, some of the key terminology that's important for this is also defining the dream ego. So the dream ego represents an actual and felt sense of identity where we're observing as a witness or actor. So it's kind of the third person, if you will. And some of the other concepts or definitions from this chapter was the guiding self, which is also an aspect of this third observer, but helps us see the narrative as well as the attitudes and actions. In this chapter, we also talked about the clinical applications of dreaming as a way to provide diagnosis, prognosis, and insight into the blind spots of the conscious mind. And so again, when I'm using words like diagnosis and prognosis, I mean, in some situations, this is reserved for more of a psychoanalytic tradition and the field of counseling or psychotherapy. But we can still use, as lay folks, diagnosis of our own dreams and prognosis of how it might get better. But I think the most important aspect of this chapter is the developmental dreaming. So it's the idea that we can revisit past stages that one or we didn't complete earlier in childhood or adolescence or young adulthood or late, whatever stage we're at. And dreamers discover themselves in pieces, fragmentation versus embodiment. So it's the idea that if we don't make it through a developmental stage, I mean, and goodness, this could be a whole class in and of itself is developmental dreaming. But when we're young, right, like 0 to 5, there's certain developmental markers that we need to hit or meet, such as language acquisition or motor use. And when we hit, around 8 years old, it's very much about making friends at school, connecting, doing some of the basic societal requests of learning how to read or write. When we look at high school, it's all about individualization, becoming your own person, having personality and preferences that are different, perhaps, than your parents, exploring things. And so what happens is each of these stages, and of course, they're more scientifically intricate than the way I've simply portrayed them, is this idea that if we don't hit the emotional mature markers as well, then what happens is we repeat what we don't repair. And I'm just going to say that again for emphasis. We repeat what we don't repair in a previous developmental stage. So for example, if in high school you never got to individuate, maybe you're 60 and you're like, you know what, I never got to try pink hair. I need to do that. And not that you can't do it at 60, that's great. But sometimes we have to go back and explore a developmental stage we didn't get. Another example is with sexual trauma. If you're someone that experienced childhood sexual assault repetitively, then perhaps that delayed or created a dysmorphia around sexuality. And so perhaps you didn't get that experience in your teenage years or even in your 20s because of that gap in a developmental marker. And so now in your 40s, you're going back and having those very teenage experiences of your sexuality. So there's a multitude of examples, I'm sure that, as a cohort, as a class, we could come up with of missing developmental markers. But our dreams can be a nice way to see if there's something undigested or fragmented and help us move towards embodiment by noticing these things. So while Whiteman and Pereira do not go that deep into this, I just wanted to add in a little bit more about the application of this. Some other definitions that are important from this chapter are going to be the shadow dreamers, so confronting difficult parts of ourself, aka the shadow personality, dream ego, which I mentioned before, which is the dreamer's actual and felt sense of identity that can be found in what ways? Yep, narrative, attitude, and action. So I left a blank here on the PowerPoint for you, and I'm going to give you the definition and you tell me what the word is. You ready? A feeling tone, aspect of the psychic energy that operates automatically. What word would you put in there? I might put an implicit bias, and I would say that's totally fair. But I'm thinking from last week of the Wednesday slide, Wednesday Adams slide, when we're talking about complex. So complex is a feeling tone where we get immediately triggered or upset by something because we have such a strong psychic energy that we haven't adequately digested, that it can be projected onto really neutral people, situation, or things. So these are some of the definitions that I want to highlight from chapter 3, the situation as it is, that I think are useful in your application to exploring what dreams mean. All right, so let's jump in. 6 categories of dreams. So I'm going to invite you to provide a definition for the 6 categories. So you can write down a dream you've had for each category, or you can just kind of write down the ideas that you associate with how that might be. Like maybe you haven't had a nightmare in a while, so nothing's coming in for you. Or maybe you're like, oh my gosh, I've had so many nightmares, like I can't even pick one. So go ahead and just take a moment and jot down these 6 areas. The first one is a daily processing of a dream. 2 is going to be a psychological processing of a dream. 3 is a nightmare. 4 is prophetic dreams, 5 is lucid, and 6 is inspirational. All right, so maybe if you're like writing freehand and you're writing all of the details of a prophetic dream you had, maybe just pause and come back to this slide or check out the course reader and you can see that I have a list of this for you for your worksheet for lesson 2. So I'm just going to give you a little definition. The daily processing of dreams are a way that our brain helps us maintain certain memories from the day and code them into long storage. So these types of dreams, they don't often have like big significance for us. And in fact, you may dream about similar activities to your waking life, like going to work or brushing your teeth. They're just routine. So some people tend to remember daily processing dreams as just a form of brain maintenance. And so those are just important for our psychological health, and they're usually pretty mundane. So next is psychologically processing. So these are more significant dreams that often reveal things about your psyche that you're not aware of, aka unconscious. And so they can show us anxieties or fears, but also reveal hopes or ambitions. So I see this connected to Freud's idea of wish fulfillment with the id. And dreams here can be symbolic, and they don't have to be chronological like we'd see in daily processing of dreams. And so yeah, it's the idea that we're processing something a little bit deeper that's emotionally related. So I would kind of underscore emotion being a big piece of the psychological processing, or affect and emotion, and affect, emotion, and sorry, I'm blinking on the third thing I'm trying to say. Oh, feeling, obviously. Affect, emotion, and feeling are three different things, and we're going to talk more about how they're different in another lecture. So know that that's coming for psychological processing. Reoccurring dreams. Okay, so everybody can relate, or I don't want to say everybody, most people can relate to the reoccurring dreams. For me, when I was younger, I had this ongoing recurring dream of flying to get away from my next door neighbor, who definitely had some mental health issues that I believe were undiagnosed, in which case he would pop into other people's yards in the middle of the night, and just was kind of a scary character in my childhood. And so I would have these dreams about running and flying and from this individual. So recurring dreams. So it's the idea that you have a recurring dream at that's the exact same, with similar elements from dream to dream, even though the content can be slightly different. The most important thing to know is that dreams reveal ongoing issues that we have in life that we haven't addressed or aren't doing well with. And so typically for this, we're thinking of something that reoccurs over a span of time. So there's more chronos or chronology with this one. So it's reoccurring once a year for 10 years, or it's a dream you've had since you were little. So that reoccurring piece is also going to be part of psychologically processing a dream. Okay, next one is going to be nightmares. I feel like this is explanatory. So they're terrifying, they can be discerning, and more than anything, they probably have the strongest messages that we're failing to see in ourselves, but they can also be accompanied by a lot more psychological symptoms, or somatic symptoms rather, of night sweats, or erectile dysfunction, or urination. So there can be this component of somatic stuff that goes with nightmares. And really trauma is an overlap of nightmares. Another one is prophetic dreams. And in the textbook by Karen Fraser, which is this really sweet little simple dream interpretation handbook that I like a lot, she talks about a student of hers that she had that dreamt of earthquakes that would happen before they occur. Right? Crazy. So in her book, she states that I have an earthquake dream, and an earthquake dream occurs within 24 hours of it happening. And so again, we could say that we could explore a little bit more premonition, but it can have a premonition quality to it, or it can be symbolic or literal in the case of that dream. Other one is going to be lucid dreams, and lucid dreams are fun because they allow you to control content while you're dreaming. And so it's the idea that you are choosing your own adventure game. And so sometimes people ask, well, how do I know if I'm lucid dreaming? If in the dream you can take control of the direction, then it counts as a lucid dream. And so in this course, we are definitely going to play with lucid dreaming by just intention setting with our dream and working to be more conscious in our sleep life and our waking life. Last one is inspirational dreams. And so that's the idea that it's a light bulb moment, or if you're an artist and you've been kind of stuck, or a writer on how to get through this creative block, an inspirational dream might be an area to explore where you can get some hope, some inspiration or joy from a vivid dream that gives you direction. Another category of dream that I didn't include in here, which I think can fall into the prophetic dreams, but is also visitation dreaming, which Karen Fraser states that it's connected to psychic mediums or others who communicate with spirits as a way to understand hallmarks of their visitations. And often a hallmark of this is that there's a hyper real quality to them. So it can be a visitation from someone who's living, or it can be a visitation from a lost loved one. And those can be really powerful. And so I would put that under prophetic dreams, or possibly psychological processing of dreams if someone recently lost someone and that's kind of how they're dealing with grief. Whew, right? That's a lot. So dreams, have a ton of categories. And I just want to remind you that while I'm giving you some ideas from different authors and dream scholars and Jungian psychology, but ultimately the intention here is to make this your own and create your own definitions that resonate and work well for your psyche. Okay, so before we jump into the actual checklist of dreams, I'm going to have us take just a little break, like 5 minutes, because we've been sitting for over an hour. And it's really important to get up, stretch, and move our bodies to take care of them. So I don't want anyone to feel like they're just kind of stuck sitting. So let's take a little pause and we will jump back in 5. All right, so welcome back. It's just about 5 minutes. If you need a little more time, know you can always put this on pause and take breaks as you need. So we're gonna jump into part one of our actual meat of dream analysis. So welcome, cheers. You can see how much context is required to do this type of work, and how it really is useful to have a clinical background, or at least, you know, a BA in psychology or a master's in counseling, and really put some effort into seeing how this all works from the back inner workings of psychology. And you can also see how easy and accessible and intuitive this work is without needing any training. So wherever you fall on the spectrum, I hope this feels enjoyable and useful for you. So part one, we're going to be analyzing some dreams here, looking at color, shape, and archetypes. So some questions for you. What aspect of the inner psyche is emerging? See the mind map slide. So when I ask this question, it's important to, when we're assessing a dream, to kind of get the ego dreamer, as Whitman and Pereira state, the ego dreamer. So it's, what perspective are you experiencing the dream from? Are you experiencing the dream as watching the dragon or being the dragon? So what aspect of the inner psyche? Is it clear that this to you has a shadow tone to it, which we'll explore more next week what the shadow is? Is it more about the self, which is the embodiment of ego, animus, persona? Or is it more about the animus, or like a gender expression of, or a non-binary expression of the soul? So what aspects of the inner psyche are emerging? So let's just start there in your dream. That's where to start, is what aspect is the dreamer ego taking? Next question is going to be, what archetypes are present? So out of the 12 wheels that I gave you, if you remember, we can deduce it down to 4. So we might want to ask, is this more of the motif of the lover, or is it more of the connection or motif with the sage, or the creator, or the artist? So which archetype is coming in? And so this might even be more like nature. And so often when I think of animals or nature, I kind of see them, and it really depends on the feeling tone of the dream, of course. But if the animal is friendly or loving, then for me, that really feels like a very maternal archetype, or lover archetype, if there's a sense of unconditional support. So next we want to outline just archetypes. And then, yay, we're going into name and color. And so when we look at name and color, name, I'm referring to element, geometric shape, or symbols. And this is where you get to consult your dream dictionary. And people often ask, which dream dictionary should I use? There's so many. I love the idea of you picking out your own dream journal that I don't recommend, because there then creates in the psyche a bit of synchronicity, or you calling to you what you need, not what I think you need, if that makes sense. So the book I'm using is A Dictionary of Dream Symbols with an Introduction to Dream Psychology by Eric Ackward. So let me spell that, because I'm not sure if I'm saying the last name correctly. It's E-R-I-C. And then last name is A-C-K-R-O-Y-D. So that's a great dream analysis book. And I do appreciate that he gives a bit of insight into Jung on dreams, Jung versus Freud, as well as some of the defense mechanisms that we're going to cover when we talk about shadow work. Because dream analysis, while it is accessible to anyone, it's couched in early psychology in the 1920s, which is psychodynamic theory. And so it's couched in a certain theory. And then we know after that certain waves of behaviorism come, or attachment theory. And so it continues to change and shift. So having a good basis of the philosophy is a nice way to start. So Eric Ackward's book is one I like. There's another book that I also posted on the course reading, which is a dream book I got for Christmas when I was 10. And so I got a dream book for Christmas when I was 10. Yeah, did you hear that? That's wild. Like, and here I am using the exact same dream book, and I'm no longer 10, and I'm an adult teaching psychology. And so it's wild to think that there can be so much foreshadowing in our life early on. So I really invite you to pay attention to whatever dream book calls you. So there are some options for you to kind of look at as far as dream books go. So you consult your own personal dream dictionary. Okay, so recap, these are the questions you're going to ask. What part of the inner psyche is emerging? See the mind map. What archetypes? We know that there's 12. And then go ahead and name colors, shapes, geometry. And you might be saying, well, I don't know what the shapes, colors, and geometry means. Well, let's jump in. So here is a little snapshot from the list of how to analyze a dream that you'll see on the course reading section under modules 2. So you can also consult this list. Every week we'll take a piece of it and then make our way down through to the various themes. All right, geometry and color. So you can see here on the slide that I have a picture of a staircase that is made up of all of these square and rectangular shapes. And within this, as we look at it, we see that geometry is represented everywhere, both within the human body, in buildings, and in nature. So elements and shapes and dreams. So Plato suggested each shape represents an element. The cube is earth, the tetrahedron is fire, the octahedron is air, the isohedron, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that one right, is water, and the dodecahedron represents ether. And all of these connect the edges of 4 equilateral triangles, right? Isn't that so neat? So cube is very earthy, fire, we're thinking kind of more triangular shapes, octahedron air, and water can also represent circles. So I just wanted to share that. There's a great book called Stone Medicine, and I'm spacing on the author, but it's really thick. And for anyone that has a practice in like crystals or 5-element theory in Chinese medicine, that is where, as acupuncturists, as doctors of Oriental medicine, we head to look at the connection in the body of elements and shapes. So Stone Medicine is a really great book to access, especially if you're an acupuncturist. One of my favorites when I'm looking at the representation of each element. Okay, so there are also many shapes in geometry that can be based on dimensions. So circle, triangle, square, rectangle, kite, our trap, rhomboids, different types of polygons that are 2D or 3D. And I included a website here, symblicon.com, SYMBOLIKON, so that if you're somebody that tends to dream in geometrical pattern or see those shapes that kind of just come to you when you're doing active imagination or any other type of altered states work, such as ketamine, that you can go to this website and get a little symbol read on what the various symbols mean. But again, I also recommend Stone Medicine as a great place to look for that. And I'll see if I can get the author of that before we close today. Okay, so some examples are going to include a shell, right? Like if you've ever walked on the beach and you pick up a shell, you kind of see how there's a spiral shape to it. And we can also see the same example of nature reflecting back to us in the shape of beehives, which are just made up of little hexagonal shapes. And the similar geometry can be found in Leonardo da Vinci's sketches. And so divine ratios were highly inspired by the sacred geometry, and so many medieval churches were created around this. So I guess what I'm thinking is I could have put a picture of the Eternian Man, which is the sketch, but just to remind you, Leonardo, it's not Leonardo DiCaprio. I know if you Google Leonardo, that comes up as well. So I just want to be clear. I'm thinking of the 1490 Da Vinci, 1490 Leonardo. And so his drawing actually is depicting a man, a nude man, but it's superimposed by a position of arms and legs that are spread apart to show that even in the human anatomy, we are kind of mirroring the sacred geometry and just how we're shaped. And so even though it represents quote unquote ideal body portions, but we can see that some of this work really sets the stage for thinking about, sacred geometry on the body, as well as in nature, as well as in buildings that humans construct. So here is an example from a cathedral. You can see the centerpiece of the different geometry. And so sacred geometry often has its roots in ancient Greece, and it's the idea that symbols are connected to the belief that God, and I'm going to put God in quotations because I don't have any particular meaning for this word. So God, how it is defined as you, which may be oneness, connection. It may be all that is, it may be source, it may be creator, it may be atheism, right? Like whatever, however you define that, but that unifying force of the universe consists of geometric shapes. And those shapes repeat, and they are said to be the building blocks for existence. Robert Edward Grant, who has a background, I believe, in applied physics, talks a lot about geometry, as well as the philosophy of hermetic. So if you're interested in more of this deep dive into sacred geometry, those are two folks I would suggest spending some time with. And so this idea is that sacred geometry places meaning in shapes, ratios, it says rations, it's supposed to be ratios and proportions, and creates a link to the study of human teleos and nature. And teleos is just human purpose. Okay, here's where it gets good. If Jung were alive right now, I would definitely sit down with him and he would be smoking a pipe and I would be having a cup of jasmine tea. Jasmine tea. Yeah, that's what we'd be doing. And he'd probably be doodling a mandala. And I would be like, can I share with you what I know about Chinese medicine from a very Western perspective? And hopefully he'd be like, yes. And then I would pull out this map over here to the right. So we can see that humans are created from fire, earth, metal, water, and wood. And so what's great about this is you can see how each of the elements generates another element. So fire is at the center of the earth, it generates earth. Earth in her body has precious metals like turquoise or silver. And so we see that boundary piece within the earth. So earth produces that. And then with metal, metal produces water. And so you might be like, well, if I have a piece of iron, I'm not going to produce water. But it's just the idea in Chinese medicine that water can collect on a sword tip or something metallic and doesn't absorb with it. So then we would see that water then produces wood because that's how we grow our plants or nourish our trees. Yep, you guessed it. When you throw wood into fire, it builds fire. It creates it. In the same way that we have a generation cycle, we also have a control cycle. I'm going to pause before I talk about the control cycle, which you can see the arrows point to certain directions, and just name that fire is associated with the small intestines, sweat, the tongue, and summer. And a fire personality is someone who is very passionate, a go-getter in life. For the earth personality, it's, and fire can also be seen in kind of like a triangular or jawline face. Earth is connected to, I think when I think of an earth person, I just think of someone laughing because we know that the earth element is very jovial and light. It's connected kind of to stomach and spleen, and fire with that passion we know is connected to heart and small intestine. So with earth, it relates to our muscles, thick saliva in the mouth. Mouth is also where we take in food. And so it's that nourishment piece. It has to do with late summer. Juicy watermelons are ready, avocados are ripe. So everything is just really earthy. And that becomes a personality type. And of course, we have all elements within us. So we're not just fire, we're not just wood, but based on the moment we're born, based on the cosmos of, if it was the middle of summer when you were born, that's a very young and a lot of fire to your imprint of personality, which is very different than if you're born on solstice, winter, cold, snowy. So introverted. So I want to name this as we're talking about our dreamscape and awareness, because dreams can have a certain tone related to an element. So fire, earth, and now metal is a theme of boundaries. And so that has to do with the lung and large intestine. Lung is our ability to inhale and let it go, exhale. And so there is this sense of boundary. It connects to skin, nose, and of course the season of fall, autumn, letting go. And the large intestine really helps let us go in a very literal way. And next we have water. And so let me just give a little bit about the metal personality. I think of that as someone who's really good with organization and following the book or the rules. So that can be like a metal personality or quality trait. Water is very much go with the flow, take it easy, slow it down. Has to do with kidney, the bladder. Water, they say, stores the ancestral memory, and that's connected to the kidneys, as well as winter. So that's why we're having a winter dream psychology, is to take a deeper look at the dreamscape, the unconscious, the ancestral story, very much a winter theme. And then water creates wood. Wood, we know, is growth oriented, right? Trees grow, and they can be really passionate as well, like fire, but in some ways aggressive. So with wood, there's this like element of bamboo. We want to grow, but still be flexible. And so that is connected to themes of liver and gallbladder. And it has to do with tendons, the eyes, springtime. And so each of these elements also have a color. So long-winded way to say we're looking at color and geometric shapes. Each of these earth elements has a geometric shape and a color as well. So, and a personality type. So as we're exploring dreams, I invite you to explore this system and apply it to your dreamscape. Kind of noticing, do I dream in black and white? Black is the color of the kidney. Or do I dream in white sometimes, metal? So I'm not going to tell you what each of the colors are intentionally, and leave that as a little activity that you can explore on your own later. The other chart that I have here is the image of a human face. And so again, as we're talking about the microcosm represents the macro, what we see in nature, we see in sacred geometry, we see in the human body. And just remind you that even on the human face, we can map out the various aspects of organs and elements on the face. So if you happen to have a very specific dream of, my third eye was open, or my right eye, which the eyes are connected to the liver and connected to the wood element, were damaged. So maybe there's a connection of wood, which is about growth, to not being able to see something. So as much metaphor as you feel comfortable jumping into, traditional Chinese medicine has so much great data for you. And we will do a little bit more work on the facial reading related to this at a later time. So just know more things are coming, but I hope this is just like a first pass for you. All right, so some of the colors here, as I mentioned, down on the bottom, all caps, homework, optional. Everything's optional. Even readings are optional. So you don't have to do any of this. It's just for you. It's for your personal growth. Google 5 element colors and seasons and include them in your dream book. And so throughout the course, you absolutely want to be keeping a dream book. And again, it does not have to be a recount of the 6 type of common dreams. It can also be any type of active imagination you're engaged in, or just insights you get or feeling tones throughout the week. Because really, when we look at the metaphor of a dream, we're really just talking about accessing our implicit bias and everything that is unconscious to us. Okay, so for some colors, and this is coming from some of Fraser's work, I believe, and it's different than how I would map on colors, so I wanted to share a different system with you. Pink is the color of love in all of its forms. Red is passion or anger. Black, the unconscious mind, void, death. Gray, fear, confusion. White, truth, coming clean. Green, healing, growth, newness. That is also the same in Chinese medicine, right? With the green being liver or wood element about growth and plants. Blue is spirituality. It could also be a metaphor of being blue or feeling blue. Yellow can be peacefulness or sunny. And then just metaphor, any metaphor that you have related to how you experience color. Another color system that I really like is using the chakras. So we know red is about root, orange is about creative energy, yellow is confidence, green is an open heart. And as we move up, it's like blue is communication and red is more about family. But when we get to the third eye or the glabella or the place kind of in between the brow, we're looking at possibly color purple, which can be like bigger family or bigger picture. And then the crown of the head is often associated with white or spiritual awareness. So again, here's one color system, but know that there's many because you're creating a map of symbol for your personal psychology, your personal mental map. And based on your own language, the language you speak, the culture you're brought up in, the preferences of your families, the biases of your family that you grew up in, all of this translates to, and even the school you're socialized in, right? All of this translates to you having your own personal symbols, as well as some objective symbols related to color or shape. So just know that ultimately you are the expert in your own dream analysis, and no book is going to give you the correct definition, but I do consult looking at a lot of different books to get inspiration. So before we conclude, I just wanted to share with you a few more insights on geometric symbols. So circles can also represent protection, influence, or unity. Spirals can be the unfolding of a spiritual path. Triangles can represent religion or have the same meaning as 3. They can also be related to a pinnacle of something like success or just a really important message is what I think of when I also hear triangles. That's fiery or passionate. Square and rectangles are earth element and have the ability to represent materialism because it's very earthy, safety or shelter. Crosses can be the coming together of multiple elements or Christianity. Pentagrams are about manifestation, earth, femininity. Vesica Pisces, or true circles side by side, is often illumination, enlightenment, divinity. So just to name a few, one interpretation of shapes, and please know that there are many. Okay, so inner work. Here's an example. Here we go. So I have a little dream that someone shared that they wanted to analyze as a class and get some feedback. So it's pretty brief, but I had a telling dream last night. I dreamt of a white wolf's head in a diamond shape. So let's pause there. I would underscore white wolf and diamond. White can sometimes symbolize lungs, right? Because of the Chinese medicine system. Lungs have to do with grief and the color white. So boundaries, when I think of lungs, is a primary theme of metal using a Chinese theory, Chinese medicine theory. And then we also have wolf and diamond. So we just talked about triangles, and a diamond is basically two triangles together. So they can represent reaching a pinnacle of something and also potentially fire. So as this person goes on to describe the dream, it says, I feel as if I'm transforming the old me and something has shifted or died, but I'm also holding myself back and not stepping into my power. I'm not letting go of relationships that prevent me from being my true self. Wow, how cool is that? So before I even read the last little sentence, the white wolf, the lung element, color white, is very much about letting go because it's metal and grief. And how beautiful that this person picked up already of the phrase letting go. And you saw in the previous slide, lung and large intestine are a pair. So it very much is holding on to something that needs to be let go of. As for wolf, I think that it's great to consult a variety of dictionaries on the symbology of wolf and use what you know about wolves just from just the basic studies of the animal kingdom. We know that wolves tend to be a social group, live in packs. It's very much about creating your own community and circle of people who you feel supported and trusted by. So again, in this dream or this motif, I would be curious to know more about how wolf or coyote, how these symbols are in unity or in community. So how is this person building a community where they feel safe and supported? So there's a little example of a dream analysis, super short, super quick. But thank you so much for your time today. It was a blast to get to look at archetypes, which I know is, typically taught a few weeks out, and just jump in right away and know that we'll also revisit themes of the shadow and the collective unconscious, because it is important to have that container before we do more deeper work on archetypes. So I hope that you have a beautiful rest of your day, and I can't wait to see you here next week.